Welcome to National Parks Traveler, where we explore the national parks and the issues that involve them.
There are, across the national park system, a number of units that have experienced near record and record visitation over the past 18 months or so. The coronavirus pandemic has spurred an outpouring of humanity into the outdoors as we seek fresh air and room to roam instead of being sequestered at home. The 2020 rush to places such as Yellowstone and Grand Teton, Rocky Mountain, Acadia, and Cape Hatteras National Seashore at the time were seen as something of an aberration, a somewhat isolated blip in national park visitation caused by the pandemic. This is Kurt Repenchek, your host at National Parks Traveler. The crowds that have been flowing into the national park system since the COVID pandemic took hold of the country have been impressive. During 2020, the count from 383 of more than 400 units of the national park system was officially recorded as 237 million. That was down from 2019, when more than 327 million visitors were counted in the park system. But 2020 visitation was greatly impacted by COVID, which closed a good number of parks for a while, some throughout the entire year. Still, the visitors came. This year, most parks have been open all year, and the visitation has surged. At Grand Teton National Park, for example, 2021 has, to put it bluntly, been crazy busy. In September, the park counted 570,584 visitors, the second highest tally for that month in park history. Notably, that count represented a 10% increase over 2019. It also pushed the park's year-to-date visitation to 3,493,937, a record for an entire year, with October, November, and December yet to come. The previous yearly high for visitation was 2018, when Grand Teton recorded 3,491,151 recreational visits. To explore this crush of visitation, we've reached out to Grand Teton Superintendent Chip Jenkins. We'll be back in a moment with the superintendent.
Western National Parks Association is a nonprofit education partner of the National Park Service. WNPA supports parks across the West, developing products, services, and programs that enhance the visitor experience, understanding, and appreciation of national parks. Learn more at WNPA.org. Whether it be strategy, business planning, change management, board development, executive search, or diversity planning, Potrero Group is here to help. They mix a depth of experience in the parks and land space with a breadth of best practices from other industries. For more information or to schedule a preliminary conversation, go to potrerogroup.com. That's Potrero group.com. Nova Scotia. 8,000 miles of coastline dotted with colorful fishing villages, quaint coastal towns, and an abundance of scenic natural beauty. Home to 2 national parks, Cape Breton Highlands and Kejimkujik. Spend your nights under a canopy of twinkling stars. Spend your days exploring trails, beaches, historical waterways, and tons of cultural and recreational experiences. Visit novascotia.com today to start planning your natural getaway. The North Cascades Institute has a large portfolio. It is an environmental learning center, training center, conference center, and leadership center, all set in the splendor of the North Cascades National Park Complex. Learn more at ncascades.org. The Grand Teton National Park Foundation is a private, nonprofit organization that supports projects that protect and enhance Grand Teton National Park's cultural, historic, and natural resources. By funding initiatives that go beyond what the National Park Service could accomplish on its own, Foundation donors improve the visitor experience and provide benefits to the National Park System for decades to come. See their successes at gtnpf.org.
Gauging visitation across the national park system is always a challenge. It ebbs and flows depending on the month and the weather, but it certainly seems to be in a growth mode for some of the larger parks. To try to gain an understanding of what's going on at Grand Teton National Park and what the impacts of growing visitation are, we're joined by Superintendent Chip Jenkins. Welcome to the Traveler, Chip.
Hi, Kurt. Thanks for inviting me on.
I appreciate you making the time. Now, Chip, you came to Grand Teton early this year from Mount Rainier National Park, another extremely popular park that had its own visitation pains. But did you ever expect to see the kind of recreational turnout that Grand Teton has seen this year?
I guess I would have to say that yes, I was expecting. I was in part because just like most superintendents, I'm paying attention to what's going on around the National Park Service, what's happening in other units, whether it's from Acadia to Zion to Rocky to Yellowstone, and so I had a sense of what was going on, but certainly learning the details is happening.
Yeah, it's one thing to watch from a distance. It's another thing to watch from the visitor center and hit park headquarters as they stream into Moose.
Absolutely.
Now, to put some perspective on Grand Teton's visitation this year, back in 1985, I was working for the Associated Press, based in Cheyenne, Wyoming. And one of the assignments took me to Grand Teton, where Marshall Gingery, at the time the park's assistant superintendent, told me the parks were being loved to death. That year, 1985, Grand Teton recorded 1,334,483 recreational visits, or roughly one-third of the number that your park could close out 2021 with. If we were loving Grand Teton to death in 1985 with a third of this year's visitation, what can we make of the impact of those 3.5 million or so visitors that Grand Teton has seen so far this year?
That is a great question, Kurt. And I think one of the fundamental to the questions that I'm asking having arrived here, which is we are trying to do a better job of assessing what this level of visitation is meaning to the park, what it means, and from everything in terms of our operations to what it means on our resources, including the resource of visitor experience. And some of that information we have, it's clearer than others. Part of what we're experiencing is it's not just about the numbers. It's about changes in behavior. It's changes in the way that people are visiting. I think probably the most obvious is while it's clear, our history has been clear in terms of visitation. The large part of the visitation between the 1st of July and Labor Day, what we're seeing is actually that the season's extended. We're seeing our largest growth in visitation is actually happening in March, April, and May.
Wow.
So we're becoming that peak season is becoming substantially longer, and that has enormous ramifications on our operations.
Now, before we go too much further, I'm curious about the tallies that you guys keep in terms of visitors, recreational visitors. I mean, you've got a major U.S. highway going through your park, 191, 89, and I think it's 26, the three routes, all in one. Do you count visitors along the highway or through the Moose entrance station and the other entrance stations? How do you get a firm count?
Yes to all of those. Right. We count our visitation in a number of different places. It's it's through the state highway, through the entrance gates. We actually also have over 40 trail counters where we're counting people into the backcountry. And so we compile information from a lot of different places. This is one of the few parks that we actually have a full-time permanent social scientist on staff. Dr. Jennifer Newton, and she works very closely with our National Park Service Statistics Office in terms of how the visitor count information is compiled.
How do your backcountry trail counters work? Is it an individual or is it something else?
It's individual. It's kind of the classic trail counter in terms of it's a light beam that you walk through and it counts the number of folks who go by. Jen Newton works together with a long-time park volunteer, used to be an employee who is retired, on running the trail counters where they go out, not just install them, but calibrate them and check on the accuracy multiple times through the year in terms of collecting that information.
Huh, interesting. Now, for instance, this year, my wife and I were up in Yellowstone, paddling Yellowstone Lake. We stopped in Grand Teton both on the way up and the way back. On the way back, we took a walk out to the Cunningham cabin. Were we counted?
Yes, you were counted. Right. And part of that is the calibration of part of it is the calibration in terms of, as a visitor who goes to Yellowstone, a visitor who comes through Grand Teton, counted in terms of going through the south entrance gate of Yellowstone, through the Moran entrance gate. And then depending upon not every destination in the park, but many of the locations in the park, we have both vehicle counters as well as trail counters.
Interesting.
Yeah. And so what we have is a lot of that raw data. Part of what a big part of what we have done this summer is through a contract is where we are doing a visitor mobility study. So what we're doing right now is an analysis where we are trying to get more detailed understanding about how people arrive at the park, where they go, how long they spend. That is something that other parks like Yosemite and Yellowstone and Acadia have done previously. Grand Teton had not previously done that. And so we're doing that for the first time and are aiming to have the results of that study late winter, early spring.
Yeah, that'll be interesting to see. I know, a lot of people go to Grand Teton, go to Yellowstone. People go to Yellowstone, go to Grand Teton. And it'll be curious to learn if Grand Teton was the main destination or was it the add-on. At the same time, Cam Shawley up in Yellowstone was telling me the other week that the average visitor to Yellowstone stays 3.2 days, which really kind of amazes me for such a park as Yellowstone. Do you have a feel for how long people stay at Grand Teton?
That is part of the information that we're trying to figure out. We do not have that as a fact-based or data-based information, and we're trying to get that both through a combination of the visitor mobility study, but we're also one of 23 parks that have been selected for a national program to do a comprehensive socioeconomic study. And that will be done next June and July here in Teton. But what I can tell you is, it's being the new guy here, it's been pretty interesting because there's a whole bunch of people who have a perception that people drive to or fly to Jackson Hole, spend a night, spend part of a day in Grand Teton, and then go up to Yellowstone and spend time there and then leave the area or do that in reverse. And so there's this, among some people, there is this strong perception that the vast majority of people visit both parks and may stay for a modest period of time. What I hear from the Jackson Hole Chamber of Commerce is the data that they have is that people stay on average 4.5 days in Jackson. And they have the perception that while they are base camping out of Jackson Hole or some of the neighboring communities, Pinedale, Driggs, Victor, and they venture up and go to Yellowstone for a day, they spend a day in Grand Teton, and then they spend 2.5 days doing other things in the Jackson Hole area, where most of those, the Tetons serve as a backdrop for much of what they're doing. So again, it's trying to sort that out. A little bit of information that we have is just some social science information that was done at our Lupin Meadows trailhead this summer. People self-reported that 45% of the people who visited the Lupin Meadows trailhead said that they also will visit Yellowstone on their trip. But, that means that 55% of the people who were there are only here at Grand Teton or Jackson Hole. What that means for us in terms of managing visitation, we haven't figured that out yet.
It's interesting, over the years running the Traveler, we've had readers reach out and saying, hey, we're going to Grand Teton, Yellowstone, and Glacier for a week. What would you suggest? And I suggest get rid of 2 of those parks and focus on one of them because they're all wondrous places that have much to offer in terms of recreational and cultural and historic information.
I think that's also part of what we're trying to figure out is what we know that there's a lot of people that are coming on their first trip. Again, we have a perception that people, when they return on their second, third, or fourth trip, that perhaps they're staying longer in one place. And again, what's that mix, right? And what is it that we need to be able to provide folks who are the first time short visitor versus people who are here looking for a deeper, richer experience?
There's certainly a lot to soak up in Grand Teton. Now, getting back to your visitation this year, in a release that your staff sent out, a press release concerning this summer, 2021, it noted that trail use increased approximately 29% compared to 2019.
Yep.
And compared to 5 years ago, trail use has increased approximately 49%.
Yep.
Those are pretty impressive, if not downright staggering numbers.
Yep.
What kind of impact is that having? I mean, how is the Jenny Lake area, which is your most popular destination, I believe, in Grand Teton, held up to that? I mean, more than $20 million was spent on the area in recent years to restore its trails, its bridges, and its key destinations, in no small thanks to Grand Teton National Park Foundation, which really did some heavy lifting and fundraising. But, that area, the Jenny Lake area, the trail system above the lake, had suffered from decades and decades of crowds that the Civilian Conservation Corps couldn't anticipate when the trail system was initially completed. What kind of impact are those increase in trail users having on the park?
Yeah, let me actually start in a different place, which is that it goes to that observation that it's not just about increasing number, but also that people are behaving differently. So we're seeing, for the increase in visitation, we're seeing a far greater increase in the number of people who are going hiking and going on the trails, right? So, and I also, will point out, I think that may be one of the differences between, for example, Grand Teton and Yellowstone, is that many of our places where people want to go, like Jenny Lake or Lupin Meadows or Taggart, they're not necessarily destinations unto themselves, but they're actually launching points into the backcountry, right? They're trailheads to get to going elsewhere. So again, this is part of what we're trying to understand in terms of the differences and the challenges with the visitation that we have. Now at Jenny Lake, what I observed this summer, what we're in is it's built into the DNA of the National Park Service that part of the way that we manage visitation is that we designate areas and we harden them in order to be able to support higher levels of visitation. And on the Jenny Lake, where much of the Grand Teton Foundation project happened, the interpretive plaza and the visitor contact station and the boat dock and the trails along that shore, the eastern shore, really actually are holding up very well because they were designed for a substantially larger level of visitation than the park had been able to manage previously. I think where we're seeing challenges is over on the west side, where either you take the boat over or you hike the 2 miles around over to Inspiration Point. And again, where the trail was reconstructed and Inspiration Point kind of created a defined area, but we certainly are seeing, I think the thing that is the greatest thing that has been reported to us is we're just seeing, increase in terms of human waste. And part of what we're doing this fall is that we're doing after action reviews, collecting information from our employees about what they saw and experienced this summer. Actually, Jen Newton, our social scientist, created a field reporter for all of our employees, accessible by all of our employees to be able to input information about challenges and problems that they saw. And Jen and an interdisciplinary team is in the process right now of evaluating that information.
Yeah, interesting. And you expect that data to come out later this winter?
Yes. Yep. And I think and we will use that, going forward. What I'm telling folks is that we need to be planning on at least 3 different timescales simultaneously. Part of what we have to do is that we have to be thinking about next summer, 2022. What is it that we can be putting in place next summer, which, frankly, on that timescale, it's working on things like public information, signage, things to be able to try to influence people's behavior. Then we need to be working on perhaps the next 5 years. Those are the kinds of things that are maybe policy changes, longer term, medium term planning. Then we need to be working on 10 to 15 to 20 years, which those are more substantial infrastructure, longer term policy changes. And so, and again, it's not, we need to be practiced and adept at working at all 3 of those timescales in order to be able to try to influence and adapt to what's going on.
Yeah, quite a challenge. We're talking today with Chip Jenkins, the superintendent of Grand Teton National Park, which is on pace to really set a record for visitation for 1 year. We're going to take a short break and we'll be right back.
Washington State is graced with 3 spectacular national parks, each different and special in their own unique ways. As the official nonprofit partner and the only philanthropic organization dedicated exclusively to supporting these parks through charitable contributions, Washington's National Park Fund has a mission to raise private support to deepen everyone's love for, understanding of, and experiences in Mount Rainier, North Cascades, and Olympic National Parks. Share your passion for these parks at WNPF.org. The Yosemite Conservancy helps visitors connect with Yosemite through adventures, volunteering, and the arts. It's the only nonprofit dedicated to supporting Yosemite National Park and funds grants to improve trails, restore habitat, protect wildlife, and inspire the next generation of nature lovers. Learn more at yosemite.org. Acadia National Park is one of the 10 most popular national parks in the United States. It is also one of the smallest and most vulnerable. That's why Friends of Acadia exists. Friends of Acadia is an independent organization of passionate people inspiring those who love this magnificent park to make a real and lasting difference for Acadia. You can make a difference too at friendsofacadia.org. Hey everyone, our partner Interior Federal Credit Union is offering a great deal to their members. Now through October 31st, 2021, get up to $500 in closing costs with a new home equity loan. Apply at interiorfcu.org for membership and a loan. Membership is required. Equal housing lender. The Blue Ridge Parkway Foundation is the primary nonprofit fundraising partner for the Blue Ridge Parkway. It is made up of people who have a deep love for this majestic road and want to ensure that its natural beauty and the experiences it offers endure for generations to come. Show your appreciation at brpfoundation.org.
All right, we're back with Chip Jenkins, the superintendent of Grand Teton National Park. Chip, so it sounds like the trail systems and the front country visitation areas are holding up pretty well to the increased traffic. Is that safe to say?
Well, what I would say is the places that have been designed and constructed, like Jenny Lake, the plaza, whatnot, have held up well. I don't want to short sell, though. At Jenny Lake, what we saw this year was not only did the parking lot start to fill by 8:30 or 9 o'clock in the morning, but then we wound up with parking along the inner park road for up to 2 miles along that stretch of road. We saw places like at Lupin Meadows where we have Trailhead, which has maybe 130, 150 parking spaces, and we had upwards of 400 cars parked there. Taggart Lake, and Trailhead, similarly. We had so many folks visiting those places that our bathrooms became overwhelmed. So we actually had to rent, a number of porta potties in order to be able to have those at different trailheads in order to be able to handle human waste, and actually wound up in the situation where the company that rents those porta potties, as a result of their own staffing shortages, were having a hard time even keeping up with the maintenance of them.
Wow. Yeah, it's certainly been a tough year for staffing throughout the economy.
Mm-hmm.
Now, a few weeks back, I talked with Dr. Joel Berger, a wildlife biologist who has traveled the world studying animals in their natural settings. He currently is working on a book regarding how human recreation is impacting wildlife.
Mm.
Can you point to any situations at Grand Teton where this growth in human visitation has affected the park's bears, antelope, moose, bison, other wildlife?
I'll tell you, that is a great question, because I think for many, many years, for decades, really, there was this thought or this belief that non-consumptive recreation was green or was not impactful on the landscape. And particularly in recent years, what we have come to see is that the scope and scale of recreation, hiking, skiing, mountain biking, has now become so large in terms of both not just numbers, but geographic extent, that we need to have a much better understanding about what that means in terms of, in particular, wildlife. Here in Grand Teton, we've had a interagency work group that has been looking at what are the steps that are needed in order to preserve the Teton bighorn sheep population. It's kind of an interesting story. The Teton bighorn sheep used to overwinter down in Jackson Hole at the valley bottom. But through decisions that were made over the last 100, 120 years, they no longer have access to low elevation winter habitat. So in kind of a crazy adaptation, they have moved to some of the most harshest conditions in the area. They now overwinter at the very summit of the ridgelines, where persistent winds blow the snowpack off, and they are able to access food. And what's happened in the last 10 years, but really accelerated in the last 5 years, is that advances in ski and snowboarding technology, in skills, in knowledge, in ability, we now see people regularly and routinely able to access that terrain to be able to ski and ride. So just earlier last week, this interagency work group, doing a collaborative process for the last 4 years, have made a series of recommendations proposing additional closures at high elevation from December through April in order to be able to protect the bighorn sheep from winter recreationists. And we're going through the process right now of evaluating those recommendations and trying to determine what we want to do. It's also very interesting because this is really serving as a catalyst for a conversation within the backcountry skier and rider community about what does it mean to be a conservationist and a skier and rider. I'll tell you, we all need, whether it's the Park Service, Forest Service, BLM communities, we need a much better understanding, much more research going into how we can all be recreating responsibly and coexist, on this landscape where people can, be feeding their souls and their spirits by recreating, but also know that they're recreating in concert with the species that also live on the landscape.
No, it's interesting, the recommendations for additional winter closures up in Canada at Jasper National Park. They have instituted longer seasonal closures through the winter to protect the caribou numbers, the southern mountain caribou numbers in Jasper National Park, because they're concerned that without action, the two caribou herds that remain entirely within Jasper will disappear. And right. So, it's good to see all these people out into the national parks, enjoying the parks and appreciating the parks and what they offer. But at the same time, it's a tricky situation when you're talking about natural habitats and whatnot, and as you mentioned, with improving technology, people can go farther into the backcountry.
I mean, it's the combination of technology, knowledge handed down from one person to another in terms of places to go. So it's
and sometimes that technology works against the user. I know in Utah, I was talking to a Forest Service backcountry officer once, and he said the problem with the technology was it was evolving more quickly than the user's ability. And so people were finding themselves in situations that they couldn't handle and had to be rescued or worse.
Yeah.
Now, Chip, anyone who has read The Traveler for a while or closely listened to our podcasts know that I have brought up the need for parks to implement hard caps on visitation. Has that time come for Grand Teton at least?
It's an interesting conversation, right? I mean, I think actually the starting point, I think, is actually from a different place in terms of what is it that we're trying to achieve and what are the tools in order to be able to get there. I also think it's important to recognize that places like Grand Teton, as well as other parks, have a long tradition of very actively managing the number of people who are visiting in different ways. There is a finite number of hotel rooms. There's a finite number of campgrounds. There is a capacity in terms of our wilderness and backcountry sites. There's a number of permits that are issued for overnight climbing on the Grand Teton. We limit the number of boat shuttles and therefore the number of people who can go across Jenny Lake on the boat to access the trailhead. There is a carrying capacity for the Lawrence S. Rockefeller Reserve, and we manage to that carrying capacity by managing the parking lot at the LSR. So there are a variety of different ways that actually we're managing to a finite number of folks accessing in different ways. The geography, the layout of Grand Teton, with a major highway that goes through it, with the fact that a significant percentage of people who are coming here are looking to access trailheads, and that those trailheads are geographically dispersed. I think that the path forward may be strategies for how we manage at those trailheads rather than a strategy in terms of how we manage the total number of people in the park.
You mentioned that there's a finite capacity for lodging in Jackson Hole Valley and in the park and the campgrounds and whatnot. And yet you've seen already roughly 2/3 more visitors than were seen in 1985. And I don't think there's been that much capacity increase in lodging. You've got, parking lots that can't handle the cars. And so you've got streams of cars along park roads, and I'm guessing probably creeping up onto, beyond the shoulder and doing some resource damage. You've got human waste on the west side of Jenny Lake. And a picture that the park sent out with the visitation showed the line of people shoulder to shoulder practically working their way around Jenny Lake. I mean, so you've got both resource damage and certainly the visitor use has to be impacted by all this.
I think that, and that is part of what we're trying to get a handle on, understand in a more quantitative and qualitative way the details of where we are, of the problems that we have, and the scope and scale of those, both in time and extent. So, for example, there are times on the trail around Jenny Lake when there are a lot of people on that trail. Is that 2 hours a day? Is it 6 hours a day? Is it longer than that? And what is it that people are, what is it that people are feeling about that experience? How is it in terms of the visitor experience that is affected? The park does not have that data yet. We launched a large effort this last summer to be able to collect that information and that data so that we have something to go on in terms of trying to make informed recommendations and alternatives going forward, rather than just individuals' perceptions of what the situation is. And part of it is we're trying to follow in the footsteps of what several other parks have done and what they have learned, right? Mm-hmm. So that places like Rocky or Zion or Acadia or Yosemite and Yellowstone have done a bunch of this research and have the information in order to be able to make informed planning and alternatives. We don't yet have that, and I'm trying to put that in place.
Does the Park Service have a responsibility to try and craft the visitor experience? Some years ago, I was talking to Jeff Bradybaugh down at Zion National Park when they were really starting on the tip of the wave that has overwhelmed the park to some degree. And he was telling me about people going up the Virgin River through the Temple of Sinawava with boom boxes and holding dance parties. And he didn't think that was an appropriate way to experience that incredible natural setting. Cassius Cash over at Great Smoky Mountains was of the opposite opinion that, people should be able to experience the park in the way that they want to experience. Any philosophy on that?
I have to say that I think it's situation for me for me, I think it's situational. So at Grand Teton, we have a place called String Lake where folks from the local community, as well as other visitors, like to go there, particularly like to go there after work to be able to. It's a relatively shallow lake. The water is warm. It's a nice place to be able to hang out and with family and friends, be able to paddle around or swim in the water. And yeah, people are showing up with inflatable toys and making it's like a picnic dinner. And what we are seeing is a greater our perception is, and again, I don't have the data on this, which I'm interested in, but our perception is that is serving as a gateway for diverse communities that may not otherwise have felt welcome in the park before to be able to come and connect to the place. Now, having that kind of activity there, I think that's different than being 9 miles back in the wilderness, where the kind of activity would be disruptive to other people who are trying to have a wilderness experience. So I think it's somewhat contextual, and it's not just about what your experience is having, but what your experience you're having on the park, including the resource of visitor experience, other people's experience. Did that make sense?
Yeah, sure. I mean, kind of situational.
Yeah. And I think it is, I'm thinking a lot about and talking a lot about how we have a changing society. We have a changing population. And how is it that we can be of service to people in terms of helping them find meaning and connect to these natural areas? And if you look, my perspective is, and there are other people who are scholars who probably have more informed opinion, about this, but there were 100 years ago, the way that people came and recreated in parks and they found their meaning. Yeah, they unfortunately people would do stuff like put fish in the geysers or boil water in the geysers or they would have grandstands and feed the bears, or they push stuff off Glacier Point for entertainment.
The firefall.
Right.
But it wasn't too many years ago when somebody tried to boil a chicken in one of the Shoshone Geyser Basin.
Right. And our ethics, our norm, our concept of how people should experience parks have changed, right? Have evolved from that time. Just in my lifetime as working for the Park Service, it was the way people would experience it was through using their 35 millimeter camera and Kodachrome in order to be able to take photographs, or maybe they would, write in a paper journal, and maybe they would carry a guitar or a musical instrument and play music. Today, the version of that today is, you do all of that on this thing, right? On a phone. And I know that there's a great deal of, from some people, there's a great deal of concern about the prevalence of technology in the backcountry. Yet, for my sons who are avid climbers and skiers and backpackers and feel an intense connection to the natural world, their experience is enhanced by using these things. So.
There's also a concern out there that the prevalence of the smartphone with the cameras is the counting coup, if you will. I'm going to go into Grand Teton and snap a quick picture and move on without appreciating Grand Teton.
And we've seen, the Graham effect. We have places like Delta Lake and Jump Rock where visitation has substantially both changed and increased. And the sense is that is a direct result of people wanting to Instagram or Snapchat their experience there. Yeah. And it is driven, the belief is that it has driven visitation to sensitive areas as a result of that.
I'm sure. I know that was a situation at Delaware Water Gap National Recreation Area back east. The superintendent, John Donahue, before he retired, was concerned about these, I don't even know what they call them, flash mobs. We're all going to meet at this location on Saturday at 10 a.m. and it would just be overrun and they had to close the area.
Yeah.
Boy, we could talk forever. I'm curious, you mentioned that you're seeing more visitation in March, April, and May, I believe you said.
Yep.
And I'm going to guess that's probably going later in the fall, both because of the beauty of the landscape in the fall and the warmer weather with climate change. How has that affected your staffing situation? I know Jeff Mao at Glacier told me a year or so ago that the early arrival of visitors were kind of overwhelming park staff, and they had some instances where restrooms were actually broken into because they hadn't opened for the season yet.
Yeah. So I think a couple of things. So I just stats here. This year, our visitation in March was up 103%, April up 33%, May up 118%. And now, if you take a look at our weather, you would see that we had relatively mild March, April, and May, and early meltdown of trails. So there's kind of an interesting thought in terms of, is that as we see the continued impacts from a changing climate and seeing trails and areas opening up, as well as just mild temperatures, should we be expecting this shift in visitation in terms of earlier and earlier in the year? Now, with that, like Jeff, we're constrained. We don't have. We're constrained by the amount of funding that we have, because every dollar that we spend on funding in March is a dollar that we don't spend on staffing in July. And we also have, due to most of our seasonal housing is not constructed in a way to be operated below freezing temperatures. So we can't open our housing up without making a substantial investment to be able to bring the staff on board to be able to meet that changing demand. Yeah. So it's an interesting, there's an interesting Venn diagram there in terms of more people coming, but all of the things that it takes in order to be able to support them. We need to have custodians and wastewater treatment plant operators and emergency services technicians and interpretive rangers to be able to help orient them. And that is dependent about both in terms of being able to fund them, to pay for them, as well as to be able to have the housing to put them in.
Yeah. Now, your neighbor to the north, Yellowstone, also has seen high visitation this year, and your two parks, I believe, are comparing notes and discussing the matter and possible ways to deal with this visitation. Have those talks advanced very far, or anything you can shed light on?
They're continual and ongoing. I mean, Cam and I talk pretty frequently about any number of things, and then the staff at Yellowstone and the staff here at Grand Teton get together and are helping to share information and learn from each other. So, for example, I had several people that went up and met with the Yellowstone staff and was taking a look at the automated shuttle system that was operating there at Canyon. They were getting together and taking a look at the situation at Midway, the Midway Geyser Basin. We're consulting with them and sharing on what we are doing in terms of our visitor mobility study, so that we are gaining, learning from what they have done in the past. I think one of the things, that we're really honing in on, right, is the degree to which do we have park-wide problems, or do we have challenges that are at specific locations, and what does the relative return on investment in terms of looking at either a park-wide or even a greater Yellowstone ecosystem solutions, or really trying to adaptively manage on a more site specific. And I think, where we are right now is that, as I said earlier, we need to be working at multiple time scales. We also have to be working at multiple geographic scales, right? And I think we're trying to hone in on the specific locations and understanding in greater detail the challenges that are there and what might be solutions.
Now, I also understand that your partners at both the state of Wyoming and there in Jackson Hole have been working with you and your staff to kind of manage this high visitation. Is that accurate?
Well, I think one of the things I think that the park that we did this last spring as we were heading into the summer was, recognizing I got here in January, recognizing kind of in March and April, what is it that we could affect during the summer, and understanding that, what our greatest opportunity was to help inform people for having realistic expectations and help them in terms of their choices. So we worked really, really closely with Visit Wyoming and with Visit Jackson Hole to be able to try to, to do that. And the messaging that was put out, and again, great credit to the hospitality and tourism industry across the state of Wyoming, as well as Jackson Hole, where they pivoted. And instead of saying, come visit, it was have a plan, particularly know where you're going to spend the night, right? If you don't have a reservation, it's going to be really difficult for you to be able to find a place to stay within 120 miles. And if you're coming here, understand that you're coming to a wild ecosystem and have the expectation that you need to recreate responsibly. And that includes respecting wildlife, respecting other people, and cleaning up after yourself.
Chip, definitely some challenging times at Grand Teton in terms of visitation. It'll be very interesting to look forward to seeing what the data shows you and how you can use that to better manage visitation in Grand Teton and make that visitor experience the best it can be.
Thanks, Kurt. I think one of the things that we're really aware of is that Grand Teton is not alone. This is something that we are facing, not just across the National Park Service, but actually across many areas of public lands. And we all need to continue to be learning from each other in order to be able to figuring out the best path forward.
That's our show for this week. We hope you enjoyed it. Next week, I'll be joined by Lynn Riddick and Kim O'Connell to discuss the role the National Parks Traveler has served for the past 16 years and why we need your support to ensure the Traveler is around for many more years to inform you of environmental, scientific, and newsworthy developments surrounding, involving, and affecting national parks and their governing bodies. And we really do need your charitable support. That's not merely a fundraising slogan. We'll explain why next week. For The Traveler, this is Kurt Repenchek. See you in the parks.
The composers and musicians at Orange Tree Productions have created a unique collection known as the National Park Series that has grown to include more than 30 CD titles. Composed against the backdrop of a park's sounds of nature, these musical scores will connect you with these beautiful places and take you there, at least in your mind. This collection is the #1 selling National Park audio series in the world and provides the background music for National Parks Travelers podcasts. Visit them at orangetreeproductions.com. Editing and production work for the National Parks Traveler podcast is done by Splitbeard Productions. You can learn more about us at splitbeardproductions.com. National Parks Traveler is a 501c3 nonprofit media organization that provides daily editorial coverage of national parks and protected areas. Traveler's coverage is made possible by reader and listener donations. Visit us at nationalparkstraveler.org.